I'd like to take some of the ideas that John Green threw out in his video and tease them out a little bit more. The idea that how the way you tell a story shapes that story. Or to maybe put it a different way, why something happens versus why it's said to have happened. After that, maybe get into another quote too, the idea that people might create after-the-fact analysis that is unable to be proven. So let's start with this first idea, how the way you tell a story shapes what is in it. You've probably done something wrong that your parents found out about at some point. I've got plenty of those examples. One of them is when I was 16, I had just gotten my license, and I was supposed to drive my sister somewhere, and I did, and I wasn't driving very carefully. Grew up in central Pennsylvania. This was in February or March. I hit some ice. The car kind of spun a little bit, and it flipped over on its side. So needless to say, I was in really big doo-doo when I got home. But I don't know exactly what I said to my mom. I'm guessing it started something like, see what happened was. So think about if you've ever started a sentence that way, see what happened was, or something like it. What you're trying to do is color the story in a way that probably paints you in a positive light. So for me, see what happened was there was a lot of ice and then some freezing rain on top of it and then sleet, which made it really, really slippery. Okay, so I am trying to say that I'm not responsible. The ice is what's responsible. I said something like, I probably shouldn't have been driving this early in my driving career, which takes some of the blame off of me and maybe puts it on my parents who let me go out in these types of conditions. What I'm doing, instead of giving a play-by-play of exactly what happened, I'm shaping this narrative in a way that is hopefully going to produce a result that's beneficial to me. So if we think about that, lots of stories are shaped by their authors. Almost all of them are, right? Whether intentionally or not. Let's use the example I've got up here. One that kind of comes to mind because one of your classmates has been making a lot of references between these stories and biblical narratives, which I think is quite helpful. And for another reason, just because this is a story that I think most people are kind of familiar with, the story of David and Goliath, right? So to give you the Cliff's Notes version of this, there are a series of wars between the Israelites and the Philistines, and at one of these wars there's a battle, and basically the Philistines offer to go man-to-man combat. They choose their best warrior, the Israelites choose theirs, they fight, but the problem is that the Philistines have a giant, and Goliath, he's listed as being 4 cubits in a span. So this is by 1 Samuel. If a cubit is 18 inches, a foot and a half, and a span's half of that, that means that Goliath would have been 9 foot 8 inches tall. And just to put this in perspective, the world's largest verified recorded man ever was 8 foot 11. So if we take just this small element, and we know that eventually David, who's probably, 5 foot or under, is able to slay him not with weapons, but with a small sling, and all these things that make this a dramatic story, let's just hang with the size for a second, though. Was Goliath that big? We have no way. We can't prove it. But if you know anything about fish stories, you go fishing, and the fish was originally this big, and then this big, and then this big. I think there's a lot of potential that stories like this get embellished. Because what does it do if a tiny little David slays a huge Goliath? What does it do if somebody with a stone kills somebody with a sword? It makes that victory all the more dramatic. And so if we think about who's telling this story, Samuel, or some people who write and pick up after he dies, we know that Samuel doesn't really like the king of the Israelites at that point, Saul. We know that later on in his life, he becomes a huge proponent of King David. So in telling this story this way, he might be giving some foreshadowing to what he thinks makes David such a great king. And by making the story bigger and more dramatic, he changes it a little bit, right? I know that's a lot, but I want you to keep that in mind as we go in. If we stick with that second quote that I've got up here, right, that there's after-the-fact analysis that is unable to be proven, we can't go back and see exactly what this battle would have looked like, right? By writing it down in this way and saying that this is why it happened and attributing victory to God and all sorts of other things. Now you've put it in writing and it becomes dogmatic. It becomes really important to folks. And you've created analysis inherent in the story that nobody else can prove. So one thing we want to do from here is now jump into some of our sources and think about what they say, what their purpose is, who their authors might be, and how they might create something that benefits them by telling the story in a certain way.